You do everything right. You're polite. You're attentive. You ask good questions. You listen. You make her laugh. And then, nothing happens. She walks away thinking you're a nice guy, maybe even a great conversationalist. But nothing shifted. There was no tension, no spark, nothing that made her think about you the next day. And you're standing there wondering what you missed. Here is what nobody tells you. It wasn't what you said. It wasn't your looks. It wasn't your confidence, at least not in the way you think. It was something much simpler and much more invisible. You never broke the pattern. The conversation stayed safe the entire time. Comfortable, predictable. And comfort, as counterintuitive as it sounds, is one of the biggest killers of attraction that exists. Because here's the truth about how attraction actually works. It doesn't begin with the right words. It doesn't begin with the perfect moment or the ideal setting. It begins with a shift. A small, almost imperceptible change in the emotional energy of a conversation. A moment when things stop feeling ordinary and start feeling like something else entirely. That moment is what separates small talk from flirtation. And most men never learn how to create it. They spend years searching for better lines, better topics, better openers. But the answer was never in the content of the conversation. It was always in the energy underneath it. That's what we're going to talk about today. Most people think small talk is the enemy of attraction. They see it as the obstacle. The boring warm-up you have to survive before the real conversation starts. So they try to skip it. They push too hard, too fast, trying to be interesting, trying to be deep, trying to stand out. And that is the first mistake, because small talk is not the enemy. It's the foundation. Think of it as a calibration phase. Two people meeting for the first time are not just exchanging information. They are evaluating each other, measuring comfort levels, testing emotional availability, reading tone, body language, pace, response style. Small talk is the arena where all of that happens. And inside that arena, something interesting can occur. If you know how to read the signals, you'll start to notice small openings. Moments when the conversation could go in a different direction. When something slightly unexpected could be introduced. When a little playful tension could be inserted into what was otherwise a completely neutral exchange. Those moments are not rare. They appear in almost every conversation. The problem is that most men are so focused on what to say next that they completely miss them. They're running through their mental checklist. Say something interesting. Don't seem too eager. Ask another question. Make her laugh. And while they're running that internal program, the moment passes. The window closes. The conversation resets back to neutral. And another opportunity is gone. Let's talk about why tension works. Because to most people, that word sounds negative. Tension is something you want to reduce in social situations, right? You want to make people comfortable. You want them to relax. But here is where the science of attraction diverges from basic social instinct. From an evolutionary standpoint, the human brain is wired to pay attention to novelty, to things that are unexpected, to experiences that create a slight sense of uncertainty. This is not a modern invention. This is ancient programming. When our ancestors encountered something unpredictable, the brain activated, attention sharpened, emotions heightened, the body prepared to respond. And here's the crucial part. That same activation system is tied directly to emotional bonding and romantic interest. Curiosity activates the same neural pathways as desire, which means when a conversation creates genuine curiosity, the brain interprets that stimulation as emotional engagement. And emotional engagement is one of the first steps toward attraction. This is why predictable conversations almost never lead to romantic outcomes. Not because boring people are unattractive, but because the brain never activates. The interaction is processed and filed under underscore underscore quote underscore 0 underscore underscore safe. Forgettable. Think about the conversations you remember most clearly from your own life, the ones that stuck with you, the ones you replayed in your head later. Were they the comfortable ones? The smooth, pleasant, entirely predictable ones? No. They were the ones where something unexpected happened, where someone said something that surprised you, where you left the conversation not entirely sure how to interpret what just occurred, where there was something unresolved that kept pulling your attention back. That experience was not an accident. It was attraction, doing exactly what attraction is designed to do. But the moment something unexpected happens in a conversation, something playful, something slightly ambiguous, something that makes the other person wonder what you meant, the brain wakes up. And that's exactly what you want. Now let's get specific about why most men fail at this. There's a pattern that almost every man falls into, especially when talking to someone he's genuinely attracted to. I call it interview mode. Interview mode looks like this. Question, answer. Follow-up question. Polite answer. New topic. Another question. Reaction. New question. It's not hostile. It's not awkward. In fact, it's completely socially acceptable. The problem is that it is completely and utterly predictable. And the brain, remember, does not respond to predictable. In interview mode, every response is processed and moved past. There's no lingering, no ambiguity, no moment where the other person has to actually think about what you meant or how to respond. Everything is neat. Everything is logical. Everything is safe. And safety, in the context of attraction, is slow death. Here's what's happening on the other person's side of the table while you're in interview mode. Their brain is on autopilot. They're responding to your questions without any real emotional engagement. The conversation feels pleasant, but not exciting. Comfortable, but not interesting. And when it ends, they'll remember it the way you remember any mildly pleasant, but ultimately forgettable experience. It disappears almost immediately. The transition from small talk to flirtation requires you to deliberately break that pattern. Not dramatically, not awkwardly. Just a small, well-timed disruption that shifts the energy from information exchange to emotional engagement. And when that happens, something changes in the interaction. You can almost feel it. The air shifts. The pace changes. Both people become just a little more alert, a little more present. Like the stakes of the conversation suddenly went up by a fraction, and neither person can quite explain why. That is the moment you are learning to create. Not through performance, not through a script, but through a conscious decision to stop playing it safe and introduce just enough friction to make things interesting. So let's talk about the first principle, because this is where everything starts. Flirtation is not about what you say, it is about how the conversation feels. Read that again. It is about how the conversation feels. Two people can have the exact same exchange of words, identical topics, identical questions, identical responses. But in one version, the energy is flat and neutral. And in the other, there's something electric underneath it all. The difference is never the script. The difference is the tone. And tone is something that can be changed in an instant. A playful exaggeration in response to something ordinary. A teasing observation about something she just said. A slightly provocative question that makes her actually stop and think. A moment where you don't immediately validate what she told you, but instead push back gently, with a smile. None of these require special skills. None of them require a specific personality type. What they require is awareness. The awareness that tone is always a choice, that you are never locked into the polite, neutral, interview mode version of conversation. that at any moment, you can introduce a small shift that changes everything. That awareness is what separates men who are consistently perceived as attractive from men who are consistently placed in the friend zone despite doing everything else. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice. Imagine a completely ordinary conversation. She mentions she's a terrible cook. In interview mode, the typical response is something like, "Oh, really? What do you usually make?" Polite. Interested. Completely neutral. Now imagine instead you say, "Interesting. I'm going to need proof of that before I believe it." Same topic. Completely different tone. Now there's a challenge in the air. A playful one, but a challenge nonetheless. She has to respond to it in a different way than she responds to a neutral question. She might laugh. She might defend herself. She might challenge you back. And suddenly the conversation has movement. That back and forth, that slight friction, that moment where she's now thinking about you a little differently. That is the beginning of flirtation. It didn't require a clever opening line. It didn't require a specific setting or a particular type of woman. It required one small decision to change the tone. That's it. Here is the next principle, and it might be the one that surprises you the most. Compliments can actually destroy attraction. Not always. Not in every context. But used incorrectly, and most men use them incorrectly, compliments create the opposite of the effect you're going for. Here's why. When you give someone a compliment, especially early in a conversation, you're offering them approval. And approval is comfortable, pleasant, nice. But it removes tension. It tips the dynamic in one direction. You've communicated that you're already impressed, already interested, already won over. Which means she no longer has to wonder where she stands with you. And the moment she stops wondering, a significant part of the emotional engagement disappears. This is not about playing games. This is not about pretending you're not interested when you are. It's about understanding that curiosity is more powerful than approval. Instead of offering praise, offer interest. Ask a question that reveals genuine curiosity about who she is. Notice something specific about her, and explore it rather than simply validating it. Express fascination with the contradiction in something she said. This keeps the dynamic balanced. She's not receiving approval from you, which means she's still trying to figure out how you see her. And as long as she's trying to figure that out, she's emotionally engaged. Engaged is where you want her. Now let's talk about something that most people completely overlook when it comes to flirtation. The pace of the conversation. Almost every man I've seen fail in this area speaks too quickly. He's nervous, even if he doesn't show it externally. And that nervousness translates into a kind of verbal rushing. Words come too fast. Responses come too immediately. There's no space anywhere in the conversation. And that lack of space communicates something very specific. It communicates that you're working, that you're trying, that you're not entirely comfortable in your own skin. Compare that to someone who speaks at a measured pace, who pauses before responding, who doesn't rush to fill every silence, who makes eye contact without breaking it to look for approval. That person communicates something completely different. They communicate presence. And presence is one of the most attractive qualities a person can have in conversation. Not because of what it says about status or achievement, but because it signals something deep and primal. This person is not afraid of this moment. Slowing down is not passive. It's not timid. It is, in fact, one of the most confident things you can do in a social interaction. When you slow down, you create space. And space invites the other person to lean in, both literally and figuratively. They find themselves paying more attention because you're not overwhelming them. They have room to respond, to reflect, to feel. And in that space, tension naturally builds. Here is perhaps the most powerful principle in this entire conversation. Leave things incomplete. This goes against everything most people do when they're trying to make a good impression. When we want someone to like us, we over-explain. We provide context for everything. We make sure every statement is perfectly clear and fully understood. And in doing so, we remove all mystery. The brain is fundamentally a pattern completion machine. When it encounters something unfinished, something ambiguous, something that doesn't quite resolve, it goes to work. It keeps processing. It keeps returning to the open loop. This is the same psychological mechanism behind every compelling story, every great movie ending, every piece of music that stays in your head for days. The incompleteness is the hook. In conversation, this means learning to leave space for interpretation. Make a comment, and let it hang there for a moment before explaining it. Say something slightly ambiguous, and let her wonder what you meant. Start a thought and let her finish it. These small openings create imagination. And imagination is what turns a pleasant conversation into something you can't stop thinking about. Here's the key insight. You don't want to be the most interesting person she's ever met. You want to be the most interesting unanswered question she's ever had. Because questions demand answers. And as long as you're the open loop in her mind, you have her attention. Let's zoom out for a moment, because there's something important to understand about the bigger picture. When a conversation shifts from neutral to playful, it doesn't just change how you feel in that interaction. It changes the entire social dynamic. Attention increases. Both people become more alert, more present, more interested in what happens next. Status signals shift. The person who introduces tension, who disrupts the pattern, who refuses to stay in interview mode, is automatically perceived as more confident, more experienced, more socially fluent. Emotional investment increases. The more a person has to think about you, the more they feel about you. It sounds paradoxical, but it's deeply true. We don't value what comes easily. We value what requires something from us. And this is why flirtation works even between people who aren't initially drawn to each other by appearance alone. Because the dynamic itself becomes compelling. The interaction becomes stimulating. And stimulation rewires perception. She starts seeing you differently, not because you said something brilliant, but because talking to you feels different from talking to anyone else she met that day. There is a distinction I want to make before we close, because it's important. There is a difference between attraction and approval, and most men spend their entire romantic lives chasing the wrong one. Approval feels good in the moment. When someone approves of you, you feel accepted, validated, safe. But approval is not attraction. Approval says, I am comfortable with you. Attraction says, I cannot stop thinking about you. These are not the same thing. And the behaviors that generate one are almost the opposite of the behaviors that generate the other. Approval comes from being agreeable, supportive, consistent, predictable. Attraction comes from being slightly uncertain, occasionally surprising, emotionally stimulating, present, but not desperate. And this is the hard truth that a lot of men need to hear. Being a genuinely good person is not enough. Being kind, attentive, and respectful are necessary qualities. But they are not sufficient, because they generate approval, not attraction. The men who naturally draw people in are not necessarily more attractive or more intelligent or more accomplished. They are simply more willing to introduce a little friction, to be slightly unpredictable, to say what they actually think instead of what they think will be well received. That willingness to create a small amount of tension is what transforms a pleasant conversation into something electric. And this brings us back to where we started. Most conversations never become flirtation, not because something goes wrong. They never become flirtation because nothing interesting happens. Two people talk. Both are polite, both are friendly. Both try to make a good impression. And because of that, because both people are working so hard to keep everything comfortable and smooth and safe, the conversation stays exactly where it started. Neutral. The shift from small talk to flirtation doesn't require a different personality. It doesn't require memorizing scripts or mastering elaborate techniques. It requires one thing: the willingness to interrupt the pattern, to introduce a moment of playfulness, a light challenge, a teasing observation, a pause that lasts just a little longer than comfortable, a statement left just slightly open for interpretation. These are not grand gestures. They are micro-adjustments, small calibrations in tone and pacing and energy, and they cost you nothing. No extra preparation, no special circumstances, no charisma you were not born with. Just the decision to show up to the conversation differently than you did before. But their effect is anything but small, because in that moment when you break the pattern, something shifts. The conversation stops being an exchange of information and starts becoming something with actual stakes, something that requires both people to show up differently, something that leaves a mark. That's the art of flirtation. Not clever words, not rehearsed lines, but the conscious decision to create a moment that neither person expected, and the awareness to recognize when that moment is available, because it's always available. You just have to be paying attention. You already know how to talk to people. That's not the issue. The issue is that you've been playing it safe, keeping everything smooth, keeping everything comfortable, protecting yourself from the slight discomfort of being a little bold, a little playful, a little unpredictable. And in doing that, you've been making yourself invisible, not because you lack value, but because you've been communicating in a way that leaves no trace. What you're learning now is the opposite of that. It's a way of being in conversation that leaves an impression. That creates curiosity. That makes people walk away from the interaction thinking about you, not because you were the best dressed or the wealthiest or the most conventionally impressive, but because talking to you felt different, alive, interesting, like something was happening beneath the surface of the words. That feeling is available to you in almost every conversation you have from this day forward. You don't need special circumstances. You don't need to wait for the perfect person or the perfect setting. You just need to make a different choice. The next time you feel the conversation settling into its comfortable, predictable rhythm, ask yourself one question. What would happen if I disrupted this, just slightly, right now? And then do it. That one moment is all it takes. From there, the conversation starts to breathe differently, and something that was ordinary becomes, in an instant, the beginning of something else entirely.